Good morning, beautiful people. I hope you're having a wonderful day so far. I just crushed a push slash posterior day. And that's actually what I want to talk about is workout splits, the pros and cons of each one and how you can choose slash make your own. Because I don't run a traditional split and I don't think everyone needs to. When I say I ran push slash posterior, that's the top half of my body I'm running push pull and the bottom half I'm running posterior anterior. And you might hear that and go, oh, well, that's weird. Why would you do that? Why not just pick one of the other ones? Well, it's because my split is designed for my weak points, right? My weak points are, well, first let's talk about split design. So whatever you hit first in a workout is going to get the best stimulus. You are the freshest that you'll ever be. So that first set is your best set. That's why I think it's very important to at least, I think warm-ups are important. It's hard to call warm-ups overrated or underrated at this point because there's such a big split on them. Some people think you need to do 3 or 4 warm-up sets for every set. Some people say you don't need to do any. I fall in the camp of you should auto-regulate them, but this video is not about warm-ups. Anyways, but that first set is your most stimulating. So whatever you're hitting first in a workout is going to be getting the best stimulus. And also, whatever you're hitting first after a rest day is going to be getting the most stimulus. So these are the principles that you should think of when you're designing a split or when you're weighing out the pros and cons of a split. So for me, well, why am I running push post? Why am I running push post pull ant? Well, if you are doing a little bit of critical thinking, clearly push. Okay, my chest is a weak point. My chest is the weakest thing that I have. And then my triceps are also a weak point. So that allows me to, after a rest day, hit push. I get to hit chest and triceps. So those are getting prioritized. And then I get to hit the posterior chain, glutes, the hamstrings, which are what I need to prioritize for my legs. I could do a traditional anterior posterior, or I guess, see, this is again where people argue is they go, well, is anterior posterior really just push pull? I think if you're going to run anterior posterior and you're going to do chest and triceps on that day, and then with quads and adductors, just call it push pull and just avoid this instead of calling it anterior posterior. Because true anterior posterior, in my opinion, is chest and biceps and delts, and then adductors and quads. But a lot of people call it basically push with adductors and quads. See, again, splits are arbitrary. Names are arbitrary. It doesn't fucking matter. It's just go lift. Anyways, when we're talking about this split, so that's where I run the chest, triceps, and my delts grow. I literally look at a lateral raise machine and my delts will grow. I know that sounds, it's like, why am I complaining about that? I'm complaining because I want some honkers. I want some just milkers hanging off of me, but we always want what we don't have. So I'm trying to grow my chest and then I'm trying to grow my glutes. My coach told me that I have a flat ass. So we need to get that bigger. And then my hamstrings are also weak, especially my glutes my quads are my strongest point on my posterior chain, my lower body, not my calves, my quads and my calves. So I shove calves at the end. I used to just skip them because calves actually do get hit from doing knee flexion. So when you're doing hamstring curls, you are going to be training the gastroc a little bit because it assists in knee flexion. That's why if you've ever had sore calves after hitting a leg day and you skipped calves, that's probably why, if you train hamstrings. But yeah, that's why I run the weird split that I do, is because it hits my priorities. I get to hit my priorities fresh after a rest day. Everything that I want to hit, that I want to grow more, is right after a rest day. And then my next day where I do pull and anterior, or pull with quads and adductors, I get to, in terms of my back is less of a priority, but I still want to, my back and my biceps, both of them are not really priorities right now, but that allows me to target the parts of them that are priorities. It's like my physique as a whole, my back is not lacking. My back is one of my better body parts. But when we niche down and we look at my back in general, because the back has a lot of muscle groups, right? It's like you can't just say, oh, I'm hitting back today. That's like saying, oh, I'm hitting legs today. Like there's so many different muscle groups that do different things that make up those bigger muscle groups. So with back, my lats are lacking. compared to my upper back and my erectors. So I hit lats first, and then and then we can go on to traps and then biceps last, and then move on to my quads and my adductors. And this allows me, again, it's just about your priorities. So if you have different priorities, maybe for you, you need to grow your legs. Or I have female clients, right? They run lower upper because they are really just focused on their legs, or they'll run full body so they can get 3 times frequency, and they'll hit lower body first. So that's the other thing is, when you're designing a split, the first thing that you want to think about is, what muscle groups do you want to prioritize in terms of your exercise order? And you want to also think about what muscle groups you want to think about frequency as well. So the difference between 2 and 3, I really don't think is huge, because when we're looking at it, there's trade-offs, right? So doing an upper lower or an anterior posterior. So we can talk about the trade-offs between upper lower, anterior posterior, and push pull, because I think you can call all 3 different splits. The main trade-off exists between both push pull and ant post and upper lower, is that with push pull and ant post, that you're going to have more joint strain, because you're using the joints, even though you're performing antagonist actions. So on your push day, you're pretty much only training elbow extension. Then on your pull day, you're training elbow flexion. And then same thing with quads, it's extension versus flexion. Even though you're training antagonist actions, that joint is still getting stressed every time that you're going into the gym. Whereas with upper lower, your joint gets rest. So it's not even necessarily about the muscles, the trade-off of the muscles being hit and getting to rest. You also have joints, and joint health and longevity I've talked about this a lot, but is one of the things I think is most overlooked when in this current phase of gym talk, of gym discourse, is people are always talking about how do we optimize for muscle growth, and less about how do we optimize for joint health and for longevity. Because I've said this before, the guy who trains somewhat unoptimal for muscle growth but optimal for longevity and joint health is going to make better gains than the guy who trains for optimal muscle growth but not optimal joint and longevity health. Because the guy who, obviously, injuries happen. Even if you're doing everything perfectly, injuries are just going to happen, right? People tear their ACL just walking. So, but if we are managing these things, we're trying to prioritize longevity, doing something that's somewhat unoptimal for muscle growth, but you can do it for 6 years, is going to be a lot better than if you're constantly getting injured doing things that are optimal for muscle growth. Right? Because you just get to train longer. And bodybuilding is an old man sport. It's a long game. It's about how long you can stay in it. If you're injured all the time and you're having to take months off of training, then your 2 months of optimal training don't matter if you had to spend 3 months not training because you hurt your knees, or you have to switch to doing unoptimal stuff because you hurt your knees or your shoulders. Knees and shoulders are the two that I always see get hurt. Anyways, that's the trade-off between doing a push-pull, ant post, or an upper-lower, is the joint stress. And then when we talk about the other trade-off is the crossover fatigue. And this can be minimized with good programming. So for example, if you're doing a true ant post, then ideally you're limiting your pressing motions, because you want to limit the amount of triceps, because you're going to be hitting triceps on your posterior day. If you're doing a push-pull, you don't really have to worry as much about the trade-offs about crossover stimulus, because like if I'm hitting, the only thing is there is some that is always unavoidable. For example, the long head of the triceps extends the shoulder. So when you're doing even rows or lat pull downs, and the same thing with like lat pull downs is the lower chest does shoulder extension. So you have little tiny bits of crossover that are going to happen, and how much these impact you is going to be very dependent on the individual and your biomechanics as well as your programming. Because some people are just super tricep dominant pressers, and other people are more delt dominant pressers or pec dominant pressers. And this again comes down to individual biomechanics and your own leverages and your bone lengths and even just muscle insertions. So this is where programming can get more in the weeds. And that's where I think you need to be a lot smarter. You have a lot less room for error in your programming when you're doing a push-pull or an ant post compared to an upper-lower. Upper-lower is a very forgiving split because of how long. Upper-lower is honestly one of the best splits simply because of how forgiving it is. You don't have to really worry as much about the crossover fatigue, and you don't have to worry about the joint stress. Upper-lower for most people, that's what I have most of my clients run is upper-lower or lower-upper, depending on what they want to prioritize. Now, let's talk about the difference between running at one of these 2x frequencies and a 3x frequency, which would be full body, or running one of these, but doing it 6 times a week and obviously not resting. So the big thing here with all of this is going to be central nervous system fatigue. And that's essentially just perception of effort is what we can boil it down to. And it happens during your workout and post workout. So during your workout, that's just kind of that feeling when you are gassed by the end. By the end, those last couple sets, they're not as good as the first couple. That's CNS fatigue at play. And then we also have CNS fatigue that carries over. And this is because you have inflammatory markers in your blood, your brain detects them, increases your perception of effort, decreases motor unit recruitment. A whole bunch of yap, basically just saying that you get tired. After a workout, you damage your muscles, or during a workout, you damage your muscles. After the workout, your brain detects, gym brain after a lift. During your workout, you damage your muscles. This damage causes inflammation. These inflammatory markers go through your bloodstream, your brain detects them, and because of that, it limits your output, essentially, on subsequent days. That's the most dumbed down version. I'm sure someone's going to crucify me in the comments for not being super physiologically correct, but I'm just trying to make it simple. So that's essentially why we take rest days, is to let this sort of subside. And this is the main thing. So the CNS fatigue during your workout is what we're trying to minimize. That's why we can't just do 8. That's why you can't stay in the gym for 9 hours a day, right? And the CNS fatigue after a workout is why you can't just never do a rest day. And some people, so that's where if you're doing upper lower 6 times a week or any of these 2 times frequencies and you're just doing them 6 times a week with 1 rest day, you have to be very, very smart about your programming. And this is where you're probably going to want to do less volume per session and maybe drop the intensity a little bit. You probably shouldn't be training to failure, at least not very often, if you're going to be doing training 6 times a week and you're going to be doing lower volume. So if I was going to do upper lower 6 times a week, I would leave 1 rep in reserve I would do 1 set for each muscle group. I'd probably do like 2 sets for a muscle group. And again, this is just like getting to that. You just want to get to a weekly volume number, anywhere from that 4 to 12 sets. And I know that's a big range, but that's because it depends on the individual and it depends on the muscle group. Certain muscle groups recover better than others for certain individuals. So you're going to want to think about these things. And I would keep the sets low. I would keep 1 rep in reserve, except for on my last set of that muscle group. So let's say I was doing for biceps, let's say I'm doing 1 set of a preacher curl and then 1 set of a recline curl. I would probably leave 1 rep in reserve on the preacher and train to failure on the recline if I was doing it in that order. Or I might even just leave 1 rep in reserve on both, since I'm going to train it again in 2 days. And that's again how all 3 of these, I've talked about this a lot, but volume, frequency, and intensity are the 3 levers or dials that you can turn, and they each affect each other. I like to think of it as like those sliders on video games, where when you slide one up, it kind of slides the other 2 down, or like that. That's how I like to think about volume, intensity, and frequency. And so that's the main thing when you're thinking about doing training 6 times a week. But then it's like, okay, what's the other way to get 3 times frequency? Well, we can train full body 3 times a week, but then we run into the issue of central nervous system fatigue during the workout. And can you really keep your motivation that high to be training super hard and getting good stimulus on those sets towards the end of the workout? Maybe you can, maybe you can't. This is again going to depend on the individual and how you program it and your cardiovascular health. So these are all just things that you need to take into consideration when building the program. And then we have, okay, can we crank it up to 3.5 times frequency and do full body every other day? Now, this is again another one where you have to just mess around with the intensity and the volume. Because if you're doing full body 3 times a week, you have those 2 days to recover. So you can probably train a little bit harder, maybe do a little bit more volume than you would if you're doing every other day. And the other, I guess this is the one that I skipped out on, is the one that I do, is 2.5 times frequency, where you do one of the 2 times frequency splits, upper lower, and run it with 1 rest day. So I train 2 days on, 1 day off. So you can train 2 days on, 1 day off, 1 day on, 1 day off, 6 days on, 1 day off. And I've played around with all of these. This is my favorite. The way that I do it is 2 on, 1 off is my favorite. The only downside with doing this, and then same thing with full body every other day, is that you can't line it up with the days of the week. So if a lot of people don't like doing that because it doesn't line up with the schedule very well. Obviously, for some people that matters, for some people it doesn't. And for me, it doesn't. But those are just some of the things that you have to think about when you're building a program. Building programs is honestly there's a lot that goes into it. But yeah, I hope you learned something. If you did, drop a like, subscribe, ask me your questions in the comments. That's all I got for today. Love y'all. Peace.